Hi, and welcome to the Communities of Learning and Practice Interview Series. Today we're with Tessa Maurer from the CIMA Research Foundation and Director of Science Strategy at Blue Forest. She's also the one of the co-author leads for the World Drought Atlas. Nice to be with you today. So as a first question I'd like to ask you, Tessa, is what is the World Drought Atlas about, and what is it trying to achieve?
Yeah, thank you for having me. The World Drought Atlas is a visual resource for policymakers. It aims to illustrate the widespread and systemic nature of drought risks around the globe, but then also to reframe our thinking around drought management, to have it be more of an ongoing and cross-sectoral approach. And then lastly, we are hoping to connect the work of drought resilience with other international goals. So the Drought Atlas talks about the ways that drought intersects with biodiversity and climate change, and how achieving drought resilience also means advancing in these other realms. So there are a lot of sort of positive feedbacks that are available to us in this work.
Thank you. And so, yeah, speaking of the content of the atlas, can you take us a bit through what are the main parts?
Sure. So the Atlas has 4 chapters. The first is an introduction, and there's 2 things that this introduction is really trying to convey. The first is that drought occurs in all regions of the world, including areas where we don't traditionally think about drought impacts being a problem. The second is that drought hazard is different from drought risk. So hazard is sort of the ever-present reality that droughts will occur, but risk also incorporates the exposure and vulnerability of these systems, and we have leverage over those factors. So there's a way for us to kind of a pathway in to managing these risks and mitigating them. The second chapter talks about impacted systems. So we look at public water supply, agriculture, and ecosystems, among others. And we want to talk about how those areas are affected specifically before we zoom out and discuss the ways that risk cascades across sectors. We talk about food security, migration and displacement, conflict, but we also talk about cooperation and the ways that drought can be an impetus towards increasing collaboration, which I think is really key. Chapter 3 then moves to regional cases, and these regional cases were all written in collaboration with local drought researchers. And so they're really able to offer a perspective on how drought impacts can differ by region, and also how local stakeholders and information can be critical to adequately managing the risks. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, we talk about adaptation and offer some pathways forward to consider responses to drought that are systemic. And so this isn't about giving comprehensive, pass-by-pass instructions on how to deal with drought, but it is intended to help policymakers reframe their thinking.
Thank you. And speaking of reframing the thinking, we saw that in the atlas there's a really need to shift from a paradigm that is so-called reactive to proactive, and now there's increasing talks around prospective drought management. What does that actually mean? And can you speak a bit about that paradigm shift that is needed?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So, I think we all are familiar with the ways that we tend to manage disaster in a reactive way, which means that we're only responding once impacts and harms have begun to accrue and materialize. So we're really advocating moving away from that entirely towards this proactive and prospective management. We think both are valuable, but prospective management has potentially even more power in the long term to manage these risks. And here's why. There are 2 big differences I want to highlight between proactive and prospective management. The first is that while proactive management tends to look at preparing and mitigating drought risks specifically, prospective management looks at disaster risk holistically. And the reason that that's really important for drought is because, as these events get longer, they get more intense, there's an increasing likelihood that they are going to co-occur or even trigger other hazards. So you can think about drought and heat waves, very common occurrence, drought exacerbating the risk of wildfire, and also even flash floods. And so thinking prospectively can help us manage all of these things at once. The second big difference between these two approaches is that proactive management aims to anticipate these risks, but prospective management actually aims to avoid those risks developing or increasing in the first place. So to give an example, you could have a proactive action that might be adjusting cropping patterns to reduce water usage in anticipation that a drought might be coming. Okay, but prospective action in that same area would be introducing climate smart agriculture. And so in that case, this system it might be resilient to multiple different kinds of hazards. And it also may be even help sequester carbon. So in the long term, that's going to reduce the climate change impacts that can increase drought hazard.
Fantastic. Thanks for taking us through this difference between prospective and proactive drought management. So perhaps as a last question for you, I'd like to understand a bit, what are the key messages from the Drought Atlas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have three that I want to highlight. The first is that drought is not a natural phenomenon. It is a socio-natural phenomenon. We tend to think of these hazards as, kind of something we don't have any power to control, but risk is deeply informed by human action, whether it's because of climate change, worsening drought intensity, or because our, human systems are set up in a way that increases vulnerability and impact. The good news of that is that we have a way of managing risk. We have levers that we can control. The second message is drought is systemic and it has to be managed as such. So we have a tendency to manage impacts sector by sector. We're going to manage for agriculture. We're going to manage for public water supply. But until we think about the cross-sectoral and cascading impacts, we're going to risk only exacerbating the problem. So if drought reduces, for example, the availability of low carbon energy sources like hydropower or nuclear power, we might be tempted to replace that with carbon intensive, gas sources. But of course, that's kind of a band-aid to the problem, because in the long term, that's going to increase the climate change impacts and then increase our drought risk. And then finally, I think we wanted to highlight that the role of global and national institutions here is to empower local stakeholders. So this is particularly evident in the regional cases chapter, where we talk about how many impacts of drought are local, but also that the most effective solutions come from these communities. And I think one of the best examples of that is our chapter on our spread on indigenous communities in the southwest of the United States. And it explains how these communities are uniquely vulnerable to drought, but also how they have a unique perspective, resources, they have accrued knowledge that can support drought resilience. So 9 times out of 10, communities know what they need. And it's about listening to them and getting them the tools, the money, the resources to enact those solutions.
Thank you for your time, Tessa. And go and check out the World Drought Atlas.
Thank you.